You know, there was a scene in this episode where Tilly looks at Burnham and says, "We could use you at Starfleet Academy." And Michael Burnham says, "Don't tempt me." And I took that as Star Trek basically saying, yeah, Starfleet Academy is basically gonna be just a direct sequel to Star Trek Discovery. Deal with it. And I, for one, am here for it. Hello there, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well, and I am here to review the latest episode of Star Trek Discovery's 5th and final season. This one, episode 6, titled Whistlespeakers. And as per usual, I will stay spoiler-free for just a few minutes and then get into spoilers in the back with a warning. So, staying spoiler-free, what did I think of the episode? I think this is a fantastic and frankly beautiful episode of Star Trek Discovery overall that might be in the running for my favorite episode of the season. And I think that is most especially because of how much this episode attempts to grapple with a lot of core issues at the heart of Star Trek from its very inception, even, you know, well-meaning problems and issues. And I think it handles it mostly with aplomb in very subtle and overt ways without, you know, hitting you on the head with it, but really just kind of touching upon that. I'll get more into this in the spoiler section because I think there's a lot of really good nuance here, but we get in this episode just a good old-fashioned away team episode that we have not seen really in modern Star Trek all that much. And I think probably the one that sticks up most in my mind is the episode New Eden from way back in season 2 of Star Trek Discovery, but there's also been a couple in Strange New World here and there, but just a good old-fashioned away team episode that we don't always get from time to time, as well as wrestling with, you know, the Prime Directive and things like that. But, and again, I'll talk more spoilers about the nuance of how this episode handles that, but something that's always been pervasive throughout Star Trek is that, you know, there was this idea of this Prime Directive, which was a kind of well-meaning concept when it was created in the 60s, and sort of evolved into Next Generation in more interesting and sometimes problematic ways, which was this idea that we don't interfere with what was termed less evolved, less technologically advanced civilizations. But within that, there was always this judgment of these civilizations as like being less evolved, primitive. There was even in that term pre-warp civilizations that we often hear used, and even used in this episode of Discovery, where there's this assumption that there is this sort of progress to warp. Like warp is this inevitable end of civilization, sort of mirroring how Star Trek and the Federation and Starfleet developed technology, but also mirroring these ideas of like, oh, Western technology, of how like America and Europe had built technology and built their civilizations are just the inevitable way all societies go, and everyone else is primitive and uncivilized. There was always this idea of this like natural arc to evolution of a society that, you know, we're just waiting for people to eventually reach, and our Prime Directive is us just sort of like staying out of it and not wanting to get involved. And then there's also other elements of the Prime Directive that also get very problematic. But that element of it was something certainly that this like judgmental view, whether it was meant in a good-natured or paternalistic sense or not, is still a judgmental view. And what this episode of Discovery, I think, really handles overall really well, though still from a Western perspective, at least from, you know, the show being from America and written by mostly Americans, though I don't know exactly who the writer or who's in the writer's room for this particular episode necessarily, so, you know, asterisks on that. But still, it's still from that perspective, attempting to try to subtly deal with some of those issues. And again, I'm also not, you know, an indigenous person or a person from groups that have been colonized or judged by Western culture. So again, asterisk on all my statements here, but there was just this great line that the episode walked where there was a respect for cultures that were different and did not hit these technological barriers, but also not a judgment or fetishization, and also not saying like they're the way they do things is better or worse, but also sort of like talking about how societies generally evolve and equating it to how we in the Federation, Starfleet, and as an equivalent to sort of modern day America are also dealing with these same questions, where we get the same questions that these characters in this group are dealing with through characters like Culber. And so again, I will talk more in spoilers, but the line that this episode walks with all of that, I thought was very well handled, and I'm sure there's nuances here and there of things that it screws up or messes up, but I think it was attempting to get at that in a really wonderful way. And it also goes to this growing theme throughout the season that we've been seeing so far of spirituality versus science, and how we often think that these two things are at odds. Even Gene Roddenberry himself, who wrote Star Trek, was someone who always sort of said, like, religion is a way that people are oppressed, religion is something for stupid people. He literally said that. But this episode, again, I think kind of plays with that and says, look, the spiritual and science kind of marry each other, very Carl Sagan contact sort of idea. And even to a degree, I want to give Gene Roddenberry some credit. You know, I have many problems with the man, but he did get some elements right. And you can see that with Vulcans, for example, too, being a species that have a deep spiritualism to them, even while, you know, being based in logic and not necessarily seeing those things as opposed. And I think Discovery is pulling upon that style of thread here to go into these larger questions. So as you can see, in how I'm discussing this episode, you know, I don't think it's like one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek, modern Star Trek, or even Star Trek overall, but it is one that I think this episode is really grappling with in so many things, and doing so very beautifully and wonderfully, and with some fun, intriguing ways, and some cool world building setups, even in just a little episode here and there that all tie into each other, and also our larger character arcs. This was wonderful, and I think it might be one of my favorite episodes of the season so far, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. So with that all said, let us get into spoilers so I can talk more specific about some of these things. And yeah, we'll go land on the planet here, I guess, is the transition I'm going to use. So now that we're in spoilers, let's go through the whole episode. We start off the episode with our characters trying to figure out what was going on with this bottle of water, this vial of water, not bottle of water. It wasn't like a whole bottle they grabbed, but the vial of water that we got from last episode as the next clue, and them finding nothing unique about it. It's just water. And so trying to figure out new ways to figure this out. I like that. It wasn't just a scientific clue that we got here, but something that actually thinking about anthropology and trying to other different ways of how we can think about water. I think that was just a cool idea. And then it brings us over into Kovich's Infinity Room that he's always hanging out in, and Burnham sort of this scene was very interesting to me, and actually something that I want to chat about for a second here, because Burnham goes in there. First she says, "I think you were born in this room," which Kovich doesn't respond to, and I'm like, was he born in this room? Was that like an oblong hint to that? But more importantly to me, is Kovic. We'll talk about what the actual scene was about, but Kovic mentions at one point, like, I like older things, and I have this legal pad, which is actually a authentic 21st century legal pad, and Burnham asks him where he got it, and he says, "I have resources." And I'm sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, is my theory correct? For those of you who don't know, I think I called this last season, it might even been in season 3, but I definitely called it in season 4, is that my theory is that Kovic is Future Guy from Star Trek Enterprise. If you have not seen Star Trek Enterprise, a little bit of spoilers for that show, though I believe this guy appears in season 1 of even the pilot episode. But Future Guy was this guy during the temporal wars that we saw happening in Star Trek Enterprise, who was, trying to communicate with the Solubans in order to get them to do his bidding in the past. He wasn't able to come to the past, was trying to get the Suluban to do his bidding, as we saw in numerous different episodes. Now, Star Trek Enterprise was angling to have it be revealed that Captain Archer was in fact Future Guy, and was even hinted at in one of the episodes, I believe Shockwave Part 2, the season 2 premiere of Star Trek Enterprise, where Archer in the future comes out of Future Guy's pod with the Suluban for other reasons. So like there was hints towards Archer eventually being revealed as that, but because the show got canceled, that never actually got resolved. And so this big hanging open thread in canon in question with Star Trek is, who was Future Guy? Sorry, my phone is going off. So since that question is open, I have always theorized that since Kovic has this mysterious element to him and seems to have some knowledge about the past and history and time, that he would be Future Guy. And this legal pad, dang it, texting. This legal pad, I will turn that off. This legal pad is kind of what I'm thinking, hinting towards that. So please, dear heavens, Discovery, give me this. Give me this answer, especially since this is your final season. Please answer who Future Guy is and have it be David Cronenberg, because I want to imagine David Cronenberg talking to Scott Bakula in Star Trek Enterprise. It would warm my heart in so many different ways, both as an Enterprise fan, as a Scott Bakula fan, as a David Cronenberg fan. I am here for this. Please, please, please let this be a clue to that. We shall see. We have 4 more episodes this season. I want it so badly. All right, it has been a few minutes for me because those texts that you were hearing were actually from my editor for my movie Identities. She's finalizing VFX and had a bunch of questions for me. The work never ends. One day my movie will release. We're so close, folks. I swear to God, I will get out of VFX one day. Sorry, I've been going up a wall with VFX on my movie. Almost there. Anywho, back to this, a show that has much more VFX than I do. Though my whole space is a special effect because I'm special and it's affecting you. I'm gonna stop. I'm filming this late at night. I'm tired. I got notes. Let's go. Anywho, Kovick gives Burnham the list of scientists who were part of the team that hid the progenitor tech, and they sort of bring it down to this one scientist who was a Denobulan. Again, starting Enterprise references, my little Denobulan boys. I love them so much. And they are able to use that clue, again, in this wonderful way of like thinking outside the box, not just scientifically, to be able to narrow it down to this one planet that was in the Denobulan supply lines. And we learned that this scientist, the Denobulan scientist, I forget his name, had built these weather towers to be able to stop these storms on this planet and help the indigenous population of the planet be able to have rain. But he is doing so in violation of the Prime Directive. And again, this is something that gets into what I was talking about in my spoiler-free section, which is talking about how is the Prime Directive it always rule? Because the big problem that I've always had with the Prime Directive is that there is this well-meaning to it of like, we don't want to get involved in other civilizations because that can lead to a colonizer mentality of coming into stealing resources, using your technology that is can be more violent, more powerful in certain respects to be able to take control, and the Prime Directive is a great way to try to avoid that. The problem with the Prime Directive often comes down to it being an always rule where it's like we always follow this or else by like punishment of like getting thrown out of Starfleet, and also with it then being used in a very judgmental way, and also numerous other ways too, where it's like saying there's, we can't even interfere even if the entire civilization was going to be blown up by an asteroid, as we saw in that one episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds last year, season 1, I think it's like episode 2, Children of the Comet, I believe that was, maybe there's also other episodes that deal with it too. Even Star Trek Into Darkness has that at the beginning of it, and some episodes of Next Generation, and even Voyager, and even Enterprise with its worst episode, Dear Doctor, or one of its worst episodes, Co-Generator's up there as well. Sorry, I'm rambling now. Long story short, this Denobulan breaking the Prime Directive, but is that okay? Is kind of a question here. But also, does that mean there is not a responsibility on what he did and what it causes for the civilization over 800 years? And I love that this is using the 800-year time difference here between Discovery and the 24th century of most of the Star Trek we'd seen up to this point, 23rd, 24th centuries, because we can see how the civilization has evolved from this technology being there. So loved all of that. And I love the setup of this world where Burnham and Tilly beam down and we get this whole culture of people like talking about dust, them like having lived outside, like this older woman gets caught in the dust, but she has this sense of service where she talks about, it's like, if I didn't do it, someone else would. So this idea of service and caring for the Great Tower that they call it, which is what gives them the ability to have rain on this planet, the weather tower. Loved all of that. The other thing too that I want to get to here is Burnham, after they find this, she starts listening to the Whistlespeak of these people. And again, I was worried that this would fall into a little bit of fetishization of these people. Because there was, even within the judgmental attitudes, there was also this like fetishization of indigenous folks, of different people that were viewed as primitive throughout both stories and history that was very infantilizing and still had that, again, colonizing mindset on top of it. But Burnham actually kind of eschews that a little bit, where she does not judge or fetishize this civilization, but uses it as just appreciation as an anthropologist for how people speak to each other. And there was never the sense of like they're less evolved, but getting there. It was just understanding like these these people. You can understand these people through how they speak to each other, how they understand things like words like pain, and how many words they have for it. And just get an idea into their culture through it. I thought was really, really, really beautiful. And these things like they recognize different gender identities. We even get a non-binary character in this episode with Brava, the one religious guy's child that we get throughout this episode, and that not being viewed as like, oh, a less evolved thing or anything like that. It's just like, this is what their civilization sees and recognizes. And again, I thought that was a really non-judgmental way to do that. Even within some elements of like Star Trek we get here, like they even use the term pre-warp. I always like the term non-warp civilization. Just a civilization doesn't have warp. I think that's better instead of pre-warp, because pre-warp assumes the gradual, eventual getting to warp, which is not how civilizations would always evolve or grow in different ways. So I think that term is in here, but we also get in some deconstruction of that later on. We then go down to the planet, and Tilly and Burnham talk about Starfleet Academy. Again, I love their relationship too, like Tilly having this moment is like, I can take the Zeno after the anthropologist. Nope, lost it. Thought that was funny. But again, we're setting up Tilly very much for the Starfleet Academy spin-off show, which I'm having a lot of theories about. People have been talking about it online. Mary Wiseman's been very coy about whether she's even in it or not. I'm fairly sure she probably is, given this whole season. But there's also been talk, like Culber, Wilson Cruz's actor Culber, referenced that he may appear somewhere else in Star Trek after the season of Starfleet Discovery is over.
And I'll also say this. It's Star Trek. You never know when you're going to see us again.
That is so true.
So I'm taking it as like, well, Stamets is looking for purpose. Maybe Stamets becomes a teacher at Starfleet Academy next season, and Culber comes with him. Hell, we even got allusions to maybe Burnham joining the Starfleet Academy in this. And I'm just here for if they just like, yeah, Discovery is canceled, but all the characters go over to Starfleet Academy for the most part, and just it's basically just Discovery 2.0. I would love that. That would be a great way to get around the stupid streaming thing of like, we cancel shows after 3 or 4 seasons, and even it being a godsend that Discovery got 5 seasons. So yeah, all of that is just I'm curious to see where that's going to be. But Tilly wanting to be a good teacher, and like her students wanting to go, and her trying to like, I can't, do I pull them back? Do I try to protect them? Do I try to have them follow the direction that I want them to go in? And just her struggling as a mentor and teacher about how best to enable, those in her care's freedom and choices, but also knowing that sometimes they want to prove themselves too quickly, and as a result maybe make decisions that aren't the greatest overall, or maybe rushing too fast into something. It's just that balance as a mentor, and enabling, but also trying to, and uplifting, while also trying to be aware of the dangers as well. Gets brought up and reiterated between Brava and their father, who is the sort of religious guy that they encounter here, and they, again, this old woman who has dust in her lungs that Burnham kind of befriends is near death, and we get this wonderful scene where they are able to heal her using their medicine. And we get this moment too where Tilly and Burnham's like, she doesn't have to die, we could use our own medicine, but we can't interfere with this civilization because of the Prime Directive. But then this civilization being able to heal it themselves. And again, going to this idea that like Western style medicine, our culture in, America and other European based cultures will tend to be like, oh, our medicine is the only way, and all this other stuff that's just is spiritual nonsense or whatever. But there are cultures that have medicine that works. It's just not in the way we understand how medicine works. And this episode kind of reflects that. It's like, yeah, there's this part of like Tilly and Burnham saying, oh, she might die because we can't get our medicine to her. But then they are able to heal her with their own way. That does not necessarily reflect how we would do it, but they are able to do it, and it works. And it works just fine, which I think is again, a really wonderful way to show that. We then learn of this race that people can enter to be able to get into the tower, which then Burnham and Tilly take as like, oh, we need to do that to be able to get in there because we can't beam in. This is our way to do that without really breaking the Prime Directive or anything like that. So they take part in this, and Brava wanting to join as well because they want to prove themselves to their father and say, I'm grown up, I'm an adult, kind of mirroring what Tilly's going on with in her situation as a Starfleet Academy instructor, which again, like the parallels there. But then Burnham has this quick conversation with this older woman. Again, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, but she talks about, and I love the little hints in this conversation about like, oh, my friend won this ceremony. I can't imagine what it would be like if we were here together, alluding to the people who enter this thing die. But Burnham takes like, oh, it's just been a long time. She probably passed away at some point, intervening, not knowing what ultimately lies at the end of winning this race. So I like that little hint there. But I also love this woman saying that you can you don't have to enter this race. You can actually find a way to commune with the gods through acts of charity, acts of connection. This idea of reframing religious beliefs not necessarily around like rituals and these sort of big moments of sacrifice and giving, but about how we connect and reframing it in a sort of community-oriented way, which I think is a really beautiful concept, and understanding how to change and evolve beliefs over time and how things can shift. I love that, and it's very Discovery, right? Like connection to each other is very much a Discovery theme, often through scientific ways, but it can be thought of in a spiritual way as well. But then Burnham and Tilly take part in this race. They eat the little like sugar cube thing that gets dust in their lungs. I like this as like a cultural thing that's kind of interesting to me. And they run and they do the race. I love when Burnham like takes a moment to stop. Tilly's like keeping runs like body in motion stays in motion. Gotta keep moving. But then Burnham jumping out of the race because she wonderfully like catches that there's this radiation leak that causes the moss to have changed a little bit over time, because it's been 800 years, which I loved that usage of that passage of time, which then allows her to go and fix the control console that has caused the tower to sort of break down over time. We learned that there was actually 5 other towers and the people around them died because they weren't maintained, which is very tragic. This also leads us to another story with Adira over on the Discovery, because Adira, they are actually upset because they feel like they haven't earned a place on the bridge. They're doubting themselves the whole time. And I love, again, this is just proving why I really love Rayner. Honest to God, I adore Rayner. I adore how they're handling him. He's frankly becoming easily a favorite character of mine in the show. In just a few short episodes, I like the guy a lot because of how they develop him. And I love this nuance here because we see Rayner supporting Adira and saying, you got this. And he's being like himself, this sort of like firm guy, but doing it in a way to uplift Adira and them and like encourage them, which I thought was so cool, because again, it would have been so easy for the show to just reiterate the beat over and over and over again that Rayner's a dick, and then he learns not to be a dick, and like that's a fine arc to have. You have an asshole at one point, he learns not to be an asshole after a little bit of time, but no, this episode shows that like the stuff he's learned a few episodes ago has stuck with him, and he actually has grown to be able to encourage people and allow others growth as well, and just shows and speaks so well of him. I adore this, because again, not to get too far in this on, I talked about this in other videos, but compared to Shaw, another character who I did like, he kind of stays an asshole the whole way through and eventually does learn towards the end, but the beat is kind of reiterated over and over again that like he's a dick. And yes, we understand, we learn why he's a dick, we learn his fears, his traumas from like stuff with Wolf 359, but the point is that he's a dick pretty much every single time that he learns and grows. But here, we kind of get that learning and growth sort of more sooner, and in a way that like gets to see him interact rather than him just learning in one final moment of sacrifice at the end. And I think that this is so much better. It's so much better and so much more nuanced, and I love it. Again, I say that as someone who liked Shaw, but this is just a much better, I think, iteration of that same style of arc that I think is fantastic. Just wonderful, just truly wonderful. Really great. No notes. Rayner kicks ass. I adore him. I am so upset that this is Discovery's final season because I freaking want more of Rayner. Moving on, though. Burnham's able to steal the console. Tilly has this wonderful moment with Bravo where they win the race together. Again, Tilly learning like how to encourage her students and like work with them to help them get them certain places, but also how they again be a danger, because we learn that this leads to a sacrifice at the end in the tower where they die from asphyxiation. And again, we see Bravo's father just horrified by this, but also conflicting with his beliefs. And Burnham saying, "Look, we're gonna break the Prime Directive. These people are gonna die anyways if we don't do this. Tilly's not gonna die for any reason. We can't do that." trying to convince the father to open up this room, and makes herself known as, through the teleporter, that, she's from the future. Not from the future, excuse me. That was a judgmental phrase even on my own part, but she was from a different civilization with different technology, and managed to convince the father to open up the door, because she silly connects with Brava and is able to get the song of their mother out of them, which the father hears and then opens the door. And again, I loved this too, because when we talk about, like, often in stories like this, when we have a character who, like, learns of an alien civilization or whatever, what would typically be termed as a more advanced civilization, the story would generally go like, oh, this is dangerous, we've contaminated their society, we've infected it or whatever, which is very weird language to use generally. But yeah, we've contaminated their society. And here, what the episode's doing, I think, again, subtly, and maybe we'll see how it goes over time, but, like, it's saying, no, these people maybe don't have a concept of what this technology is. But they're not children either. They can learn, they can grow, and they can understand it in their own way, and incorporate it into their belief system, their worldview, their way they see the world, without it being like, oh, their whole society is now going to crumble, or they're going to worship the gods that are the USS Discovery or whatever. But they can actually intelligently think about that. And I really did like that, and I like Burnham sort of encouraging him to find new ways to think about their belief system, and not necessarily, like, try to change it all at once, not trying to, like the guy himself even says it could cause violence, and be like, no, but what if you reframe it over time into understanding it as being about service, or in different ways of how we understand how we give to the gods. And she doesn't know if there are gods or not, but that just being a new way to understand the spiritualism of their society, which again was, I think, really, really beautiful, and it goes to the point that I think this trip was trying to make with the Denobi. It was like, look, I broke the Prime Directive because I wanted to help these people, but it also is a big responsibility to do so, and could cause a lot of problems. So you have to be careful with how you do it, and how you guide those who you're influencing. And that's something that reflected in Tilly, something reflected in Adira's character arc, reflected in the civilization as a whole. And I thought that was just a great through line throughout all of this. Just absolutely wonderful. But then this brings me to the final storyline of the episode with Bulk, Culber, and Stamets, where Culber is kind of having more concerns about, his crisis of faith. Book also goes to Culber being like, I'm antsy, I want to do something, and Culber's just like, go and take some time off, take care of yourself, and, Book sort of says, do you like having all the answers? And Culber really doesn't. And so this sets us up in a few scenes with him. We get the first one where he's talking with his abuela through a hologram, like this hologram, and I always find, like, resurrecting people via holograms to be a bit morbid, and Culber says it's like a grief simulator, and I think that there's ways that can be helpful. I've even heard stories of, like, people training AI to speak like a dead loved one, and that helping with grief, and I think there's value in that to some degree, but I also find it a bit morbid as well. So, I don't think there's any clear answers on that. And actually, there's a script that I was working on that kind of touched upon elements of this, and not having it be, an answerable thing necessarily, but it's just one of those, like, ugh, there's conflicting feelings on this going on here that the show is kind of glossing over a little bit to kind of get this scene with Culber's abuela here, but leading to a moment where Culber sort of doesn't necessarily see spirituality as opposing to his scientific side, but something that he could maybe explore through his scientific side, leading to him wanting to do a neuroscan. And I love the scenes between him and Stamets, where Stamets is like, they emphasize that they're a couple and he wants to do something together, and they get to work together, try and figure this out together. But ultimately at the end, Stamets like saying there's nothing wrong with you, and kind of enjoy it. This is a fine thing to enjoy. And Culber kind of feeling like Stamets is supportive, but he doesn't really understand. And then him going to Book at the end, and they have this wonderful scene where they eat dinner together. I thought that was great. He cooked for, like, just cooking for each other. Like, again, just showing the family dynamic of these two, and just Discovery generally. Love that. But Culber ultimately just resting, it's like, oh, I wanted my partner to understand this aspect of myself. And Book being like, sometimes not everybody's going to understand every element of ourselves. And yes, we want to connect, but sometimes things are just for you. And I love this as a counterbalance to what Discovery's been saying. It's like connection, 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 which is very important, but also sometimes, you know, there are elements of ourselves that like we hold on to. It's something that, you know, I think about with my partner as well. Like there are elements of myself that I don't always show with my partner, not because I don't want to, but it's just like sometimes she doesn't relate to them. And that's okay. I still love her. I think we have a deep connection and care about each other deeply, but she's not going to get every part of me, and I'm not going to get every part of her. And that's why you have other connections as well, other friends, other family members, other loved ones in our life to form those connections. And also sometimes you just hold yourself, and maybe the exploration, that search for meaning inside yourself is something that you hold on to and explore on your own. Which I like that as an acknowledgement, even though we always yearn for people to understand us. Sometimes not everything's going to be understood, even though we always yearn for. And I thought that was again, a nuanced point with this season's discussion of connection throughout. And then also Culber recognizing Book wanting to get back with Burnham and like missing that connection as well, I thought was really sweet too. So ultimately that was a really beautiful moment. And again, kind of to ramp out my thoughts, I love how all of these threads connect together throughout the whole season, throughout this episode, throughout some of the ways it thinks about like this nuance with how to talk about civilizations within Star Trek that would typically have been seen as like primitive beforehand. I think this episode really kind of just touched upon a lot of the things that I love about Discovery, and why I'm loving the season so far, is that it does have this episodic feel, but it is sort of threading it through all of these really cool narrative and thematic explorations that I think are really nuanced and thoughtful. So yeah, this season of Discovery is killing it, and this episode was great, and I think had some really beautiful moments and things to say. But I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. What did you think of this episode? I'd love to hear all that. But beyond that, my friends, I hope you all live long and prosper.